Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to week 3 of the Stroke Assembly live and in your homes. My name's Tony Banks. I'm head of conference and events at the Stroke Association, and I'm also really proud chair of the UK Stroke Assembly. We've had 2 fantastic weeks so far that you can catch up on if you have missed any of the sessions we've hosted. The first week was staying active, and last week we focused on taking action on stroke. You can catch up on all of that on our website at stroke.org.uk/UKSA virtual. So please do check that out if you've missed any so far, and pass it on, share the word. We'd love more people to join and watch these sessions if they can. This week our focus is on research and its power to prevent stroke, its power to save lives, and how it enables stroke survivors to make the best possible recoveries. We'll come on to today's session in a moment, but before we do, we want you to have your say. This is your event series, so please do say hi in the chat box, introduce yourselves, and pose your questions to today's speakers. And as always, we've got Natalie with us to take your questions and put them to our speakers. Morning, Natalie.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. If you do have any comments and questions, as always, at the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a comments box. If you scroll right down to the bottom, you'll be able to comment your text in the text bar and submit using the arrow key.
Thanks, Natalie. So do post your questions throughout. We'd love to hear from you today. If you're using social media, please use the hashtag Stroke Assembly, post on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram if you use it, and share the word as well on social. So today we're on to the second session of the week for our research themed week. And I'm really pleased to welcome Laura Piercy from the Stroke Association's research team and Helen Morse, who is a Stroke Association PhD research fellow from the University of East Anglia. Today's session is focused on vision loss after stroke. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Laura and Helen and hand over for their presentation on vision loss after stroke.
Hi everyone. Thanks Tony, thanks Natalie, and thank you everyone for coming to this session this morning. As Tony said, I'm Laura Piercy. I'm Research Engagement Officer at the Stroke Association, and I'm really excited to see so many of you here today to hear more about our stroke research. I've been working at the Stroke Association in the research team for about 3.5 years now, and if you have any general questions about our research or what we do, I'll be happy to answer those towards the end of today's session. Our charity has funded around £60 million of vital stroke research over nearly 30 years. From early research looking at the face, arms, speech, time or FAST test, to research into emergency treatments like clot-busting drugs, thrombolysis, and mechanical clot removal, thrombectomy, to research into ways to support people to rebuild their lives through rehabilitation and long-term support. We've funded research that has made a real difference to people's lives. But as well as funding important research, we want to support the people who are going to lead this life-changing research in the future. We're committed to developing the next generation of stroke research experts, the future leaders in their fields. We support researchers at the early and middle stages of their careers to develop the skills, experience, and expertise they need to become world-leading experts in their fields. The researcher we're going to hear from today is one of those early career researchers we're supporting. And I'm delighted to introduce Helen Morse from the University of East Anglia, who we're funding for her PhD. Thank you for joining us today, Helen, and over to you.
Thank you, Laura, for your lovely introduction. So today I'll be talking about a type of vision loss after stroke. So welcome everyone, I hope you enjoy this session. And so today I'll be talking about spatial neglect, which is a type of vision loss after stroke, and also giving you an idea of the sort of research on this I'll be doing over the next 3 years for my PhD. So I am funded by the Stroke Association, and I'm a PhD student in my first year at the University of East Anglia here in Norwich. So I'll go over some background and then explain my research, and at the end we'll have some time for questions. So please use the chat function and ask me any questions you'd like to know some answers for. Okay, so to begin with, I'll just give you some background about the sort of vision loss I'm talking about today. So there are lots of reasons why a stroke survivor might have problems with their vision after a stroke. But today I'm focusing on a more attentional problem after stroke, which does affect their vision. So spatial neglect is a loss of awareness to one side of space. So here's a picture that is really good at demonstrating just how it can affect someone in day-to-day life. So it's most common after strokes to the right hemisphere, so when someone has a stroke in the right side of their brain. And if they experience spatial neglect, they'll be unaware of objects or people on one side. So in this case, it looks like this stroke survivor has been given a plate of delicious pasta, but due to their spatial neglect, they're only aware of the right side and therefore only able to eat the right side of the plate. So it ends up them leaving half their food without them even realizing. And it's important to note in spatial neglect that there's actually nothing physically wrong with the individual's eyes. So the person can perceive or see the objects just fine on the right side, which isn't affected by spatial neglect, but it's more their awareness which is affected on the left side. So this is a common example, as well as many other ways it can affect their daily life. So if you imagine if they're not being able to eat the food on the left side of their plate, they're also not able to notice someone standing on their left, or they might have problems finding objects in front of them. So maybe trying to find their glasses on the table. And if they're placed on the left side, they won't be able to notice them at all. So it's really hard for us to imagine what this must be like to have spatial neglect. And it does have a really big impact on people's day-to-day life. And when I talk to people with spatial neglect, they tell me that it is terrifying. So this person in particular found it hard in terms of they bumped into things frequently. This might be people or furniture or door frames. So that's quite a common behavioural symptom that you can see if someone has spatial neglect. So it can make day-to-day life very difficult for people. So just to give you a bit more information about spatial neglect, which is really what I'm researching, it's fairly common after stroke, so it affects around 1 in 3 stroke survivors. So this is a real problem, and this means that it warrants some more research so we can help these people. Although many of these people that have spatial neglect after their stroke might only experience the symptoms for a couple of days, maybe a few weeks or even a few months, and it might recover on its own or go away on its own, there are some individuals that actually still have it more than a year after stroke. And this is quite worrying since those with spatial neglect tend to have a worse recovery than those without. So this might be for a number of reasons, but one of this being that having spatial neglect can make it really hard for someone to take part in rehabilitation or engage in physiotherapy or activities like that. So that's another reason why it's really important that we investigate spatial neglect and try and understand how we can help people with it and help them recover as best they can. So I don't know if you've already been able to tell, but it's quite a bizarre condition and it's also very complex. So although I'll be mainly talking about how spatial neglect can affect someone's vision, it can also affect lots of different other things. So it can affect the touch we feel. So someone with spatial neglect might not be able to notice if someone touches them on their left side. And it can also affect the sounds that they're aware of. So if they hear a sound on the left, they might not be able to notice it compared to if it was played on the right. So it's a very complex condition, which makes it even more difficult to firstly measure or detect, so know when someone has spatial neglect, and it also makes it harder to treat. So when we talk to stroke survivors with spatial neglect, they tell us that they don't feel like there's enough support at home. And we know this as researchers, and also therapists know this, that there's not a lot of effective rehabilitation out there or effective therapies. So there's not one that we can provide people and know that it would help them. Another issue with spatial neglect, which really impacts our ability to help people, is it's quite hard to measure. And as I said earlier, spatial neglect is very complex. Because it can affect so many different ways we receive information, so visually, sounds or touch, it's really hard for us to measure it sometimes. Not only can it affect a stroke survivor's ability to find objects within the space around them, so within arm's reach. We call this near space. So this might be trying to find their glasses or trying to eat their food. It can also affect their ability to notice objects or people in far space, so space that goes beyond our arm's reach. So this might be affecting their ability to watch television or to navigate around their home or notice people stood near them. So these two things regarding that there's not enough support at home, so therapies, and it's often hard to detect spatial neglect, is really what I'll be concentrating on in my research. And I just wanted to mention as well why this research is important. So not only does spatial neglect affect or make day-to-day activities really difficult for people, but actually when stroke survivors were asked what they think are the most important things that they would like to see researched, visual problems came out in the top 10. So this research is really important to those affected by stroke. Okay, so I'll move on to the first part of my research, which I'll be talking about ways that a promising way in which we can try and help those with spatial neglect. So the therapy I'll be concentrating on today and what I'll be looking at in my research is called SIGHT. And it basically involves stroke survivors with spatial neglect lifting and balancing some wooden rods. So the rationale behind this therapy is that from the research, we know that people with spatial neglect are quite good at reaching for objects. So it seems that spatial neglect doesn't seem to negatively affect this ability. But actually, when we ask stroke survivors to maybe find things just using their vision or tell us the size of an object purely using their vision, they're not very good at it. So it seems that spatial neglect really affects people's vision or perception more than it does their ability to grasp and reach for objects. So if we know that this ability is not affected by spatial neglect, we can use it as a way to try and improve their symptoms or reduce their symptoms. So SIGHT is a home-based therapy. It's low cost and portable, so you can do it at home or you can do it at a clinic. And it's also patient-led, so it doesn't require a clinician to be there with you at all times telling you what to do. So it's very much something that stroke survivors can do independently. So the idea is that stroke survivors are asked to reach and grasp a wooden rod so that it is balanced. So if you can imagine, based on what I've described, a stroke survivor with spatial neglect wouldn't be able to notice one half of the rod. And if you wanted to lift and balance any object, you would think that you'd need to lift it from the middle. So because the stroke survivor is neglecting one side of the rod, they think the middle of the rod is much more rightward than it actually is. So when they go to grasp it at this location and lift it, they're often really surprised at the fact that the rod isn't lifted, because to them, they are seeing the whole rod. They're not missing any of the rod. So they reach and grasp it, and they might get the feedback from the rod, so the rod knocking against the table, which indicates that it's not balanced. And these stroke survivors are often really surprised, which then prompts them to then put it back and then use the feedback they got, so the feeling that the rod's not balanced, to then try again and readjust where they were lifting. And it's thought that repeating this action and trying to balance these rods is what helps improve neglect. So just to give you some background and some evidence of when we've seen some improvement in neglect using SIGHT, there was a recent study led by my supervisor, Dr. Stephanie Rossett here, and she found that SIGHT improves spatial neglect. So when some stroke survivors with long-term spatial neglect were asked to lift and balance rods, so this is where they were doing it here in this group, there was actually an improvement in their neglect even after 2 days of carrying out the therapy themselves. So the stroke survivors were either put into a group where they were asked to lift and balance the rods, which is the SIGHT therapy, or they were put into a group where they were just asked to lift the rods from one end only. So as researchers, we expect there to be an improvement after stroke survivors are using this intervention here, because they are doing this repetitive action and hopefully getting an idea, they're prompting or understanding they're not seeing the whole rod. Whereas in the control group, they're not getting this same feedback, so we don't expect there to be any improvement. And in research, we use these two groups to understand whether the one we're interested in, so this one here, is actually having an effect, or so it's not just down to chance or just taking part in research, which is improving neglect. So as you can see here in the graph, the grey bars here show the participants who were lifting and balancing the rods, and the blank or white bars show the participants that were in just the control group, the stroke survivors that weren't lifting and balancing the rods. So you can see, even after using the therapy for just 2 days on their own in their house, there was improvement in their neglect. So when I say an improvement, they reported the less impact of neglect on everyday activities such as dressing, grooming, or eating. And they also showed an improvement on some of the tests that we use to measure spatial neglect. And this improvement was even higher after using it for 10 days. And it was also still there 4 months later. So that's really important, that we know that these effects can actually last for quite long term. So moving on, we know that using technology can make therapy at home more fun. It can also enable us to measure progress and also give the stroke survivor an idea of their progress. So technology can enable us to make therapy more engaging at home and also make it easier for them to complete. So this might be using step-by-step instructions that are displayed on screen using a laptop or a television, or they can also make them into sort of game to make repetitive therapy a bit more interesting. So with this in mind, over the last couple of years, I've been working to develop a computerized version of Sight. So that's what we call C-Sight, so computerized Sight. And really the idea of this is so that we can monitor how often people are using their therapy, whether they're improving, and hopefully make it a little bit more interesting than the conventional therapy, so the one without the computer. And it will also make it easier for stroke survivors to complete this at home by providing instructions for them to follow. So this is the setup of C-Sight in a stroke survivor's house. We have the rods here that they use, and we've got the television which presents the instructions for them to follow. And importantly, we also have a little motion tracker here, which then enables us to monitor how long they're using the therapy and whether they're getting any better. So I just wanted to quickly mention the fact that while I was developing this computerized version of Sight, we were working really closely with stroke survivors throughout. So we worked together by inviting them to the university to take part in a focus group, or basically a discussion amongst other stroke survivors with and without experience of spatial neglect, as well as carers and some clinicians. And this was a really important step in developing the computerized therapy, because it enabled us to prioritize what the stroke survivors liked, so their preferences and also their needs. So I really like this picture on the left here, because us researchers or any sort of game developer can create a program that we think that everyone would like, but actually when the users use it, they have a completely different perspective. So it's really important that we involve people that will actually be using these tools themselves at home, so stroke survivors. So the first part of my project, and really the biggest part, will be exploring whether we can actually use C-Sight in stroke survivors' homes. So is it feasible, and do stroke survivors actually like using a therapy such as this? So to do this, I'll be recruiting stroke survivors from NHS services, and they will all have spatial neglect before they're recruited onto the study. And once they're recruited, I will then visit them at their own home. So it's all a home-based study. The stroke survivors with spatial neglect don't have to travel anywhere. So I first visit them at their home to complete some tests. So these tests are common spatial neglect tests, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later on, but also some general tests on their language, their awareness, their vision, and emotion, and maybe the impact of their stroke. So we collect these before any other activities, so we can get an idea of how they're performing before they use C-Sight. So anyone who takes part in the study, so the 46 stroke survivors, will be randomly, so as if by chance, put into one of two groups. So the first group will be lifting and balancing rods, like in the research study I explained earlier. So we expect there to be an improvement after they do this activity, because it's thought to improve spatial neglect. Or the other group will act as a control, so a comparison group, to see whether the intervention, lifting and balance rods, actually improves spatial neglect. So in this group, they will simply just be lifting rods from one end. So we will set up the equipment in the stroke survivors' houses and train them on how to use it, so how to turn on the laptop, for example. And then they will be asked to complete the therapy for 10 days for 30 minutes, 2 times a day. So this feedback we've gotten from stroke survivors, and they've told us that they would be happy to carry out C-Sight for this amount of time. So after they've carried out the C-Sight for 10 days, I'll visit them again and complete some of the same tests that I did at the beginning. And this is important so we can see whether there's been any change in their performance, so whether there's been an improvement in their spatial neglect. During this visit, I'll also carry out an interview, so a short interview with stroke survivors who use C-Sight, so they can tell us how they found using C-Sight. So I think, to me, this is a really important aspect of the study, because it's really finding out how they found using it and whether they can give us any feedback in terms of what they think would make it better. And finally, I'll visit them again at their homes 1 month after they've used C-Sight, and this is to see whether any effects have lasted. So this part of the study, or part of the research, is really the first step in seeing whether we can use C-Sight to help stroke survivors with spatial neglect. It would mean that they could carry out an effective, or hopefully effective, therapy at home without leaving or having to travel. So I'll now go over the second part of my research. So the second part of the research really concerns the issues that we have with some of the tests that we use to measure spatial neglect at the moment. So the measures we use, or the tests we use, are paper and pencil, which are quite problematic. Although they're quite quick and easy to give patients to complete in a hospital or in a clinic, they often miss spatial neglect because they're only measuring spatial neglect within a small area of space. So that is an A4 sheet of paper. These tests don't pick up on the spatial neglect I explained earlier. So when people have problems detecting things in far space, so maybe noticing someone stood on one side, maybe a meter away from them, or watching television. So again, we will be using technology to try and improve how we measure neglect. So we know that technology can make these sort of tests more sensitive by making them harder or increasing the demands, so putting more things on screen so it's harder to find a certain target that they're asked to find. And it also enables us to score performance automatically, so we don't have to sit down and calculate this, which can be a real faff sometimes. But importantly, it meets the need of a test to measure neglect in far space. So that is the area of space further than our arm's reach, for example. So this is an example of our test in use. It's projected onto a television screen, so it's presented far away from the stroke survivor, and they use a wireless remote to find targets, so that is full mugs. And this is a really important step in the research, because if these people with problems with detecting things in far space, so finding watching television or finding someone in front of them, they won't get the help they need. So finally, the second part of my research is looking at how accurate our test is, so our computerized test is, compared to paper and pencil tests, so those using just an A4 sheet of paper. So to do this, I will ask stroke survivors with and without spatial neglect to complete the computerized test, and also some paper and pencil tests, so those done on an A4 sheet of paper. And then we will compare the performance from both individuals to see whether our test might be picking up or detecting neglect more than the A4 sheets of paper. So just to sum, these studies are really the first steps in exploring whether we can provide a computerized therapy for stroke survivors' spatial neglect, and also improve the detection of fast-paced neglect, so people can get the help they need and hopefully recover as best they can. I'd just quickly like to signpost to our website, so if anyone is interested in finding out more, either about spatial neglect or about our sight therapy, which can be done at home, you can go to our website. So the link is down here, so sight.uea.ac.uk, and you can sign up to receive free materials to carry out the therapy. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. I just want to say thanks again to the Stroke Association for funding this really vital research, and also to my team here at UEA. Thank you.
Helen, huge thank you for that really fascinating presentation. And Laura, thanks for being with us today too. Natalie, I know it's been incredibly busy with questions, so we're going to get straight to it, if that's okay.
It has. Thank you again, Helen. We've had some really nice comments in the box at the moment, so thank you for everyone for posting those in today. We'll try and get through as many as we can. Any that we don't get through, I will make a note of, and we'll try and get back to you to answer those. I just want to thank Claire, who's been quite active in the box. She's signposted some really interesting research at the moment that Liverpool Vision Research Unit have developed, a VFAST model. So if you'd like to take a look at that, there's a link in the chat box as well. I'll get into questions shortly. So I've got one from Annabelle. This might be for you, Helen. So if 1 in 3 stroke survivors involves spatial neglect, is it time to rethink the FAST model, particularly as it is often so missed?
Thank you for your great question. It's very important. And I know from attending the Stroke Forum last year that there's actually some really interesting research going on in the ambulance service. So they're really trying to improve recognising vision as a symptom of stroke. So it is something that's trying to be embedded, because at the moment, as you'll know, the FAST model doesn't correlate include visual problems as an indicator of symptom, but it's definitely something that's trying to happen.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got another question from Marnie. So do people with spatial neglect have similar areas of damage on the scans?
Oh, great question. There's a lot of debate about this because, as I said in the talk, spatial neglect is a very complex condition. So, as I said, it affects people in lots of different ways. So, it might affect someone's vision, but it also might affect someone's sound ability to detect sounds. So, it's really difficult to pinpoint definitive areas in the brain, although there are some areas that are often associated with spatial neglect. Those who have worse strokes tend to have spatial neglect, and those with worse strokes tend to have bigger areas of damage. So it's very difficult to pinpoint specific areas.
Thank you. And I think we'll just squeeze one more question. This might be Laura, you might be able to answer this one. It's from John. It says, will coronavirus impact the Stroke Association research funding?
Yes, is the answer, unfortunately. We know that charities across the board have seen reduced income from the fact that we can't get out and talk to people. Events like the London Marathon have been cancelled, so we've seen a massive drop in charity income across the board. Yeah, we will be spending less money on stroke research probably for the next couple of years. We don't know by how much yet, and stroke research more generally. So the British Heart Foundation are a big funder of stroke research. I think last year they funded about £18 million of stroke research out of about £100 million on research total. They've said they think their research funding budget might be cut by half, might be cut down to 50 million. And that will obviously also have an impact on the amount of money that they're able to spend. So yeah, there's going to be a big impact on research generally and stroke research for the next few years.
Thank you, Laura. I think that's all the questions we've got time for at the moment. But as I say, I will make a note of all your questions today and we'll update those in the weekly emails.
Thanks, Natalie. Tons and tons of questions and comments coming in. It shows what an important topic and how much of a popular discussion there is around some of the work you're doing, Helen. Thanks so much for sharing with us today what you're up to. I think we'd love to hear how you're getting on as this work continues. And we can definitely signpost people to more information on your work on the Stroke Association's website, can't we? And I think we'll post that link in a moment if we can. But for now, Helen, Laura, thanks so much for being with us today. It looks like we could have gone on for a lot longer if we'd had the time. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So that wraps up this week's sessions, and we've got a bumper edition of the Stroke Assembly coming to you next week, 4 sessions in total, as we move on to a week that focuses on the Stroke Association's support and what is available to you, the stroke community. Join us on Monday at 11 o'clock for a session from our stroke helpline team. They'll be on hand to take some questions and tell you the services that we've been putting in place throughout the coronavirus crisis. And also, I'm really excited about this. On Monday night, we've got the one and only Chris Tarrant from Who Wants to Be a Millionaire fame joining us for our very first Stroke Association pub quiz that you can join, and we'll post the links again now. It's free to enter. We will accept donations. Laura's just mentioned how important it is for us to continue raising funds to fund research work and other work for the Stroke Association. So please join us on Monday if you can. It's going to be a great evening. So 11 o'clock for the helpline, 7:30 for the Chris Tarrant quiz, plus lots more. And the whole program is available on our website, as you've seen on screen now. That's all we've got time for today, I'm afraid. It's whizzed by. It's been a fantastic session. We hope you've enjoyed it. See you next week. Thanks, everyone.